Thank you for inviting me to this important discussion. I think most of the issues have already been mentioned. Let me summarize it again. And I'm not sure if it was on purpose, but today is exactly on the day 10 years ago that IARC classified RF EMF as possibly carcinogenic to humans on May 31st, 2011. And this classification is still valid. And it's also not incompatible with WHO's statement that no adverse health effects have been established as being caused by mobile phone use. We have already heard what the IARC evaluation is based on, the limited evidence for carcinogenicity in humans based on glioma and acoustic neuroma, and limited evidence in experimental animals for the carcinogenicity of RF-EMF. Overall, that was the 2B evaluation, possibly carcinogenic to humans. Some additional background that is relevant here. The mechanistic evidence was not taken into account for this evaluation, as it could be if there's strong evidence. But the conclusions that were included in the monographs meeting were results based on all the in vivo and in vitro studies that did not consider confounding, that considered potential confounding by heat. So all the evidence that is here summarized was that there was weak evidence that RF radiation, for example, is genotoxic. So this weak evidence means weak evidence in support. It does not mean strong evidence against any biological mechanism. Secondly, the radiofrequency EMF, the working group comprehensively evaluated all the pertinent studies, that is cancer in humans, cancer in animals, mechanistic data. And this also included at the time already occupational exposures like to radar or microwaves that are about the same frequencies as can be the 5G. But the strongest evidence was from the personal use of mobile phones. There was a kind of an intermediate update where Joachim Schütz and I was involved in a commentary in epidemiology that was led by John Sammet, who was the overall chair of the IARC working group and also included Rodolfo Saracchi, a very prominent senior epidemiologist who has worked for decades at IARC. Essentially, this also concluded that there is massive exposure. The review update didn't kind of remove the uncertainty inherent to the possibly carcinogenic, and then a research agenda was proposed, similar to other research agendas on other exposures like engineered nanomaterials. It also concluded that we need to keep the people well informed, and altogether that the IARC2B classification implies an assurance of safety that cannot be offered. What comes next is a big survey among experts of WHO, and this survey in terms of prioritization of health outcomes when assessing the effects of exposure to RF-EMF concluded that several outcomes are of highest priority, and that included, amongst others, cancer and adverse health birth outcomes. In addition, as is the case with the IARC monographs, about every 5 years, an international advisory group is convened to make recommendations on future priorities for IARC monographs. The last one was in April in 2019, and this advisory group recommended that RF EMF, non-ionizing radiation, should be re-evaluated with high priority, and that was based on new cancer bioassays, but also new mechanistic data. The more detailed report that you can read also concluded that the epidemiological evidence remains mixed, but then goes on and summarizes the 2 new cancer bioassays from the United States National Toxicology Program and the other study from the Ramazzini Institute in Bologna. And both of these found increased risks of cancer, particularly schwannoma in the heart in the male rats. Now we need to know that the IARC monograph evaluation are hazard identifications, but the hazard identification is the basis for all risk assessment, taking into account in addition dose response assessment and exposure assessment. What does this mean for the evidence as it had been presented today? In terms of hazard identification and what Dr. Fiorella called the FR1, the frequencies that are already in use for up to 4G mobile communication, this is where the strongest evidence was for the IARC evaluation, and this hazard identification still stands. For the IARC evaluation on the FR2, the higher frequency, the current evidence from the 2 to 4G studies is probably still the best available evidence, given that there is no other kind of very informative studies. This is on hazard identification. When it now comes to risk assessment, we have to consider the new technological features of 5G, particularly the MIMO and the beamforming, etc. And this also results in uncertainties with regards to the exposure, but also the exposure assessment of epidemiological studies. And these differences need to be taken into account for risk assessment. For the higher frequencies, we also need to consider particular physical characteristics that impact on interactions with biological matter. That is the depth of penetration into tissue, for example, or the deposed energy, and also other metrics that may affect the outcome from the exposure. One important discussion is the importance on the heat or the temperature increase. Now, if you see this in context of the IARC monographs, there is the possibility to upgrade evidence from cancer in experimental animals, if there's sufficient evidence in the experimental data, to a higher evaluation of concern with strong mechanistic evidence. You can also downgrade it if there's very strong mechanistic evidence that the mechanism does not apply to the humans. And in that regard, having overseen almost 50 different monograph meetings, the only one with regards to heat that comes to my mind is drinking of very hot beverages, where there was limited evidence from studies in experimental animals where temperature above 65 degrees Celsius resulted altogether into limited evidence for an increased cancer risk in the animals, and the mechanistic evidence was very scant. So I don't see, from the large overview of all the published studies on cancer in experimental animals, any reason why studies would need to be downgraded if there is, even if there is, it's not even clear if there is an increase in temperature. I will not comment on the policy issues. I think this is for you, the STOA members and the wider civil society. I have focused my comments on the science of the carcinogenicity. Thank you.